Support for this podcast and the following message come from ADT Security, helping to protect families and homes for over 140 years. The ADT yard sign is more than a sign. It's a line in the sand. For what matters most, there's ADT. Learn more at ADT.com.
Support for On Point and the following message comes from Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Lift the burden of getting a home loan with Rocket Mortgage and get a secure, transparent home loan approval in minutes. Skip the bank, skip the waiting, and go completely online at quickenloans.com/onpoint.
From WBUR Boston and NPR, I'm Tom Ashbrook, and this is On Point. President Trump and House Republicans celebrated in the Rose Garden last week on health care. But the wave of criticism over the weekend was fierce. Even conservatives saying the bill was misbegotten. Now the Senate takes its turn, but to what? This hour on Point, what's next for American health care? You can join us on air or online, where this conversation is always on. How would the latest health care bill, affect you? Do you know? And what do you want your senator to do here? Join us anytime at onpointradio.org or on Twitter and Facebook at OnPoint Radio. President Trump was celebrating in his weekly address on Friday, said the newly passed health care package that the House Republicans brought out will be great.
It will be great health care, and your premiums will come down, and your deductibles will come down. So you'll have better health care at a lower cost. And now I'm calling on the Senate to take action. Repealing and replacing Obamacare will be a big, big win for the American people.
It will be great, said the president, but not everybody was so sure. Many, in fact, were smacking their foreheads looking at what's going on here. In the Senate, you got Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins telling ABC's This Week the Senate will look at this House bill, but start from scratch.
The Senate is starting from scratch. We're going to draft our own bill, and I'm convinced that we're going to take the time to do it right. Speaker Ryan today said that he hoped that the Senate would improve the House bill. I think we will do so, and that we will come up with a whole new, fresh approach that solves the legitimate flaws that do exist with the ACA.
All right, let's see what's going on here and where it may all go. Joining me first from Washington is Mary Agnes Carey, senior correspondent for Kaiser Health News, covers healthcare reform and federal health policy. Mary Agnes Carey, welcome back to On Point.
Thanks for having me.
President says it's great, but here's a couple of other views. Charles Blow writes, the obscene spectacle of House Republicans gathering last week in the Rose Garden to celebrate the passage of a bill that would likely strip coverage from tens of millions of Americans. Obscene spectacle, he says. And Ross Douthat, conservative, writing here, calls it a misbegotten Obamacare quasi-replacement with the favorability ratings of diphtheria and the strong support of almost nobody on the right who cares about health policy. How's the House bill sinking in? We've got applause from the president. We've got brickbats from elsewhere. How's it sinking in over the weekend?
Well, who I'm listening to really focuses on the clip you just played from Senator Collins. Leading Republicans in the Senate have said to the House, thank you very much for this measure. We're going to write our own. We're going to look at this and examine it and do a Senate solution. So I think that's the most important thing here. You've got key committees of jurisdiction in the Senate. The Finance Committee is extremely powerful, handles health care and tax reform. There's the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. That's Lamar Alexander, who's the head of that committee. He's been very outspoken that the Senate will write its own package. So we saw this move last week with rapid speed through the House. You might remember a week ago today, there were leading administration officials out there talking about how the House was going to vote last week. They did so with a revised bill that does not have a score from the Congressional Budget Office that would say what the changes to the bill would do. There was a lot of concern from Republicans in the Senate saying we're not going to do it that way over here. So really expect the Senate to sort of hit the brakes, turn down the volume, look at this measure, the House measure, but also come up with their own solution that they think might work better.
So, I mean, you've got Warren Buffett over the weekend picking up the tax break theme. He says it's a huge tax cut for guys like me, above all else. And maybe it is. I mean, there's people writing that this is the Republicans setting the table for tax reform this fall, and there are reasons they might want to cut a bunch of spending here rather than in addition to there. But what about on the health care front? Who gets hurt? Who gets helped under what's come out of the House? If this became the law of the land, Mary Agnes, what would that look like?
Well, the Medicaid program, which deals with the poor and disabled would take a serious hit over 10 years. Just about $840 billion in cuts. The funding structure for Medicaid would change dramatically rather than being an open-ended entitlement where the federal government and the states share that expense. The state expenditures are matched on a percentage basis by the federal government. That would be set to a set amount of money, a per capita cap or a block grant. And the reality there could hit quite hard to the poor and disabled. We've got to remember in this country that Medicaid covers about 70 million people. It pays for half the births in this country, about two-thirds of the nursing home care, and 14 million fewer people would lose their coverage on Medicaid over the next decade. So that is problematic. Also in the House bill, the way that they allot subsidies, money to help you buy health insurance, is far less generous. In the Affordable Care Act, it's based on your income, and the less you make, the more you receive to pay for your health insurance. And also, if the price of that health insurance increased, the subsidy increases. In the House-passed bill, it's a flat $2,000 to $4,000 worth of money. Up to age 29, you could get up to $2,000 to help pay for your policy, and $4,000 for those age 60 or older. And that subsidy could be used on or off the marketplace. So the thought is with that subsidy structure, it won't be as generous for anyone, but especially older and sicker people could get hit harder because the House bill allows those people to pay more for their health insurance. The Affordable Care Act says you can't charge an older person 3 times more than a younger person. The House-passed bill would allow a ratio of 5 to 1 and even higher if a state went for a waiver. So that's a problem. And one last key point about that House bill that's going to hit roadblocks in the Senate: no Planned Parenthood funding for a year. House conservatives love that. Some Senate conservatives may love it, but some Senate Republican moderates and certainly the Democrats hate that provision. That's another one of a winner and loser equation.
And then there's just the simple question of who would be covered, how many would be covered. As you say, they didn't wait for the Congressional Budget Office to come out with a tailored estimate on that, though there's some ideas out there. On Face the Nation yesterday, White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney was talking with host John Dickerson about access to health care. You hear Dickerson trying to pin him down. It's a little wiggly. He talks about access rather than actually having health care.
Everybody will have coverage that's better than what they had under Obamacare.
But he says everybody in the nation. So even Obamacare didn't cover everyone.
Well, again, what we talked about before is the access to it. Remember what Obamacare gave you. Obamacare gave you insurance, but not health care. A lot of folks who were technically insured either couldn't afford the premiums or couldn't afford the copay. And that's what we've been driving at, giving people the care that they want, the quality that they need, the affordability that they deserve. That's what we're talking about, actual medical care, not just insurance.
So, but the president, when he says everyone will have health care, that sounds like a pretty simple thing to either say yes or no, that's going to happen.
And we'll look forward to doing that.
We look forward to doing that. What about real coverage for all? Is that in here, Mary Agnes Carey? Is it closer to Obamacare, or is it, as the CBO gave the last plan here, further away, 24 million people further away?
Right. I mean, that certainly bears consideration. The Congressional Budget Office, as you noted, the official scorekeeper for Washington, said to the House bill that was out in March, the one they brought to the floor and pulled back, that would mean 24 million more people would lose coverage by 2026 and 14 million fewer people on Medicaid, part of that 26 million number. So the point you raise about access, coverage, affordability, all these buzzwords are all kind of intersecting now and swirling around. It's very clear that there have been some issues with affordability for people with the Affordable Care Act. There is no doubt. If you qualified for a subsidy to help with your premium, for most of those folks, 85% of people on the Affordable Care Act exchanges qualified for a subsidy, but there are millions in the individual market that do not. And their plans were changed in some cases substantially because of a package called the Essential Health Benefits that all policies must cover. Things like maternity care, pediatric care, prescription drug coverage, hospitalization, that kind of thing. Before the Affordable Care Act, there were some plans on the marketplace that were fairly skinny, if you will, bare bones, but people like them. I've heard people over the years since the implementation of the Affordable Care Act tell me they just wanted to get those policies back. Maybe it's a 55-year-old guy that doesn't want maternity care. He doesn't care about pediatric services. He wants a very tailored package to him. Some people are very happy with the high deductible, high copay, but low premium packages that offered a sort of a pared back package of coverage than the more generous coverage within the Affordable Care Act. So that is, I think, some of the intersection of the comments we're hearing. And there is access and then there's coverage. And it's really in the eye of the beholder what people want to buy, what they can afford. Right now, as we talk about within the Affordable Care Act, things are mandated in a certain way. But the House Republican package could add a lot of flexibility, a lot of variables for states to offer packages, different sorts of packages.
Talk about the numbers in the Senate and what Republicans must muster. How many of their own senators can they afford to lose and still have a chance of getting something through?
Sure. Well, to special budget rules in the Senate, the majority, it's 52 Republican, 48 Democrat. With a package of rules called reconciliation, they can get by with 51 votes. So they could lose, they being the Republicans, could lose 2 Republican senators, have the vice president come in and cast the winning vote. But when you have Republican moderates like Susan Collins, Rob Portman of Ohio, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Cory Gardner of Colorado expressing concerns, for example, about the Medicaid changes, that's a problem. We talked a moment ago about Planned Parenthood. Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski have been critical of that provision. So while Republicans run the chamber and budget reconciliation allows them to get by with 51, they've got some problems within their own caucus. And I think that's why they are going to take their time and try to build this within the Senate to come up with a package that they can pass. But then, let's say that happens in the Senate. You'll have a Senate package, you've got a House package. They're going to have to get together in what's called a conference and produce a package that both chambers could pass. And that could really be a tough haul.
Does it look to you as though something coming out ultimately is assured here, that they'll ultimately have a Republican health care plan to offer in response to the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, as an alternative or a fix or replacement? We'll see what it's called. But could they come up empty-handed?
Well, I don't think that's impossible that they come up empty-handed because they're coming to the issue from very different positions, and getting that middle ground could be really hard.
I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point. We're talking this hour about American health care, headed to the U.S. Senate after the big House vote at the end of last week, what the Republican plan would mean and how it may change along the way. Mary Agnes Carey is with us from Kaiser Health News. You can join us as well. How do you see what the House Republicans came up with last week? Are you all right with a bill that would leave tens of millions more uninsured? We'll see what the numbers finally are from the CBO on that front. Is this a giveaway to the rich, a betrayal of the poor and middle class? And what's the path that would leave us better off than with current Obamacare? Not do damage? Put us in better shape? Paul Ryan, celebrating the Rose Garden last week, yesterday he was on ABC's This Week, said the House GOP health care bill was a rescue mission to fix the problems of the Affordable Care Act.
Obamacare is collapsing. Obamacare isn't working. What good is Obamacare for anybody, let alone a person with pre-existing conditions, if you don't have a health insurance plan that you can even get? So this is a rescue mission to make sure that we can achieve the goals we all want, which is getting the cost of coverage down and making sure that everyone has access to affordable health care, especially and including people with pre-existing conditions.
Especially and including, we'll look at that. But Obamacare is collapsing, have to do something. Here it is. MSNBC on Friday, Massachusetts Senator, Democrat Ed Markey slammed the House Republican bill, said no way it'll pass the Senate, dead on arrival.
It guts Medicaid, takes $830 billion in Medicaid funding for grandma who's in a nursing home with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, for people who need opioid treatment, for the disabled, for poor children. And it takes that money and gives it as a tax break to the wealthiest 1% in our country, dead on arrival in the United States Senate. No chance at all.
No chance at all. Well, we'll see. But man, what characterizations. Obamacare collapsing, the new one dead on arrival. We need an emergency crew in here. Paul Howard is with us right now, Senior Fellow and Director of Health Policy at the Manhattan Institute. Mr. Howard, thank you for joining us today.
Tom, thanks for having me on.
And Jonathan Cohn is here, Senior National Correspondent for the Huffington Post, covers healthcare, social welfare, politics, and he has been following this deeply and for a long time. Author of Sick, The Untold Story of America's Healthcare Crisis and the People Who Pay the Price, Jonathan Cohn in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me on the show.
Jonathan, step back here. We're sort of, this is what always happens with healthcare. We mere mortals get sort of blown over by all the elements of it and how they fit together and what it all means. From 30,000 feet, what happened last week?
What happened last week from 30,000 feet is that the House Republicans voted on a bill that will suck $1 trillion over the next 10 years out of federal health care programs. And I zero in on the money because, hopefully, health, as you say, health policy gets very complicated. And hopefully with Paul and Mary Agnes on the show, we'll get into some of the weeds and the interesting stuff. But when you pull that much money out, that is money that is helping people to get health care. That is going to be pain for people. That is people who are depending on that money to get their health insurance that is being taken out of the system. And as a result, you're going to see the number of people who lose access to care. That's the word Republicans love to use, access, is going to be in the millions, many millions. And it's just a question of who feels the pain.
So is this what Warren Buffett's talking about when he says it amounts to a huge tax cut for guys like me? Does that trillion come out of some people's care and into other people's pockets?
To a great extent, yes. A lot of that money is going straight to tax relief. Now, some of it goes to companies that pay taxes now that help finance the Affordable Care Act, but a lot of it does go to very wealthy Americans. The Affordable Care Act, to help pay for this expansion of health insurance, to help pay for expanded Medicaid for people, for example, it imposed a new tax that fell exclusively on the wealthiest 2 to 3% of American households. They'll get that money back. And, for the richest 400 family households in America, I think it's about a $7 million average tax break they're going to get. And that does, I think, say something about the values here. I mean, this is taking money away from people who need that money, lower income, middle income people who need that money to get health insurance, giving it to the wealthiest members of our society.
Paul Howard, jump in here. You've been no fan of Obamacare. We'll look at where this may go in the Senate, the kind of changes that may emerge there. But take the House bill on its face. You've got Ross Douthat saying that this bill that came out at the end of last week has the strong support of almost nobody on the right who cares about health policy. Does that include you, Paul?
I think the AHCA has some serious problems. It's got some good things in it, but the serious problems go to the structure. I think that, the criticisms of the tax credits in the law that although they are going to be more affordable for younger folks, if you are an older, sicker person living in a high-cost state, those tax credits are almost certainly not going to be sufficient to get a plan that's affordable when you think about the deductibles you're going to have. So that's a serious concern. Other serious concerns around the individual mandate, a part of that, whether or not you can get these young and healthy people to sign up. I do think the core idea Republicans are approaching, can be made to work and is a sensible one, which is let's lower costs for younger, healthier individuals, get them back into the insurance market. That can lower premiums across the board. And I think on the left and right, we'd still agree there is a healthcare cost crisis in the U.S. The ACA actually took, I think, close to $800 billion out of Medicare to help pay for coverage expansions under the ACA. I don't think anyone would refer to that as sucking $800 billion out of Medicare. The assumption is that providers respond by becoming more efficient. That is still the space we need to work on, lowering costs for the young people, getting them back into the market while still giving people with pre-existing conditions, older people, affordable care options as well. That, I think, is a strategy we can approach from asking the states to take more responsibility and say, look, if you like the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, you can stay there. If you can come up with a better way of delivering high-quality coverage, especially to people who are both younger and who may have these pre-existing conditions, let's look at that.
Mary Kay, jump in here on the issue of who pays what. Of course, there's been the individual mandate, which hypothetically forced people or penalized them if they didn't get insurance. Now, this plan imagines lower premiums for the young, but higher for some of the older and maybe poorer. Do you see the dynamic that Paul's describing here working? If you lower premiums and use that as a kind of a lure instead of the stick of individual mandates, that you might get more young in the system in total, Mary?
Well, that's certainly that's a goal that they have tried to achieve in the Affordable Care Act, and Republicans would like the same thing. But Republicans have their own solutions to try to get people in the market, in the sense of the underlying House bill says if you stayed out of the health insurance market, right? Let's say instead of having the penalty, the percentage penalty that's in the Affordable Care Act, if you stayed out of the market under the underlying Republican bill and then tried to come back in, you'd be hit with 30% higher premiums for a year. And then if your state goes for one of the waivers the state can apply for if they have a better way to reduce premiums or increase enrollment, increase choice, and someone had a lapse in coverage of more than 63 days, then you can get in and look at the changes in the community rating, walking away from charging everybody in the same area, the same age, that kind of thing. So I think that the Republican plan just has a different way of getting at it than the Affordable Care Act did, but both of these measures are trying to, yes, encourage younger people to get in and to stay in and to have incentives, financial incentives that you'll pay more if you don't do that.
Jonathan, what about trying to expand the participation of the young in the fashion outlined in the new House bill? Does that work to you, or is that or not?
So, I mean, the trick with any insurance system is to get enough healthy people in, right? And this is why we're talking about it, getting healthy people in to pay for the bills of the sick. And it is complicated. It's hard to do. The Affordable Care Act's approach, as you said, was to try to get everybody in a community rate, everybody pays the same rate, and not let too much variation on age. And we are seeing that in a lot of markets, probably most markets, they are not getting enough young people. And so, one response, the Republican response, is to bring down that cost for young people. The catch is you got a trade-off there, right? So if you're going to allow young people to pay less, well, then premiums are going to go up for older people. So what are you going to do there? I think in general, the liberal response would be, well, what else can we do to make this more affordable for young people? Can we improve the subsidies? Do we maybe, give them so that insurance seems cheaper to them? Do we increase the penalty? Maybe that's something that people would talk about. The conservative approach, obviously, is to sort of go the other direction, let young people, pay less for their insurance. And you can do that, but then the question is, all right, well, what are you going to do for the 55-year-old then? Because that 55-year-old is going to end up paying a lot more for their insurance. And let's face it, if you're talking about, the trade-off between a young person getting insurance and an old person getting insurance, that old person probably needs the insurance more. So that's, that is a really big concern. I think in general, most liberals would say, the idea of letting young people get cheaper policies is not something they're totally against, but you got to show that you're going to protect that older person too, and that's the hard part.
We've got listeners calling from all over the country. Let's go to Jason in Friendship, Maine. Jason, thanks for calling. You're on the air.
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Yes. This is Trump Care is what it will be, and this will be bad for Maine because of the age population in Maine. And it'll also be bad nationally for people who want to strike on their own and be self-employed. And this will be particularly bad in both those groups.
Okay. If you're older, tough. If you want to go out on your own, tough. What? I don't know, Paul. Do you see this being tough for people who aren't employed by a big employer who's taking care of them?
That was, I think, the hope of the ACA was that this would free up people to be entrepreneurial. I think the reality is, we talked earlier about the subsidy structure under the Affordable Care Act, which, is great. Look, if you're low income and have poor health status, it's really it's a win for you. But for these other folks, I think these entrepreneurial folks, they're still facing extremely high deductibles, probably not getting any subsidy or a tiny bit of subsidy. Those people are sitting it out. We've got 6.5 million people who are basically paying the tax penalty under current law and not buying insurance, and another 12 million people who've been excused, who've gotten a waiver. That's actually the problem I think that both, maybe Jonathan and I would think about. Maybe we'd have slightly different solutions to that problem. But for those folks who are in that boat, I have a feeling that a lot of them are just staying put in the individual insurance because they're looking at the exchanges and saying that still isn't a good deal for me.
Let's go to Cyril in Tampa, Florida. Cyril, you're on. Thanks for calling.
Yeah, hi, Tom.
Hi.
So I'm actually one of those self-employed people. I'm a father of 4, and since the ACA or Obamacare came into being, my rates have gone through the roof. As it stands with my deductibles and premiums, I have to pay over $25,000 to just start getting any kind of benefit from my health insurance plan. And I have no choice or I have to pay the tax penalty. And my first plan, my Humana plan, dropped me because they got out of the market, and there's only one company left, which we have now. So it's been a disaster for me as a self-employed person, and I'm looking forward to what the new government puts together.
Cyril, did you say you pay $25,000 per year in premiums now, or was there some subtlety in what you said there that I missed?
That's premiums and deductibles combined until I start getting a benefit.
Okay.
Until they actually start paying for it.
Yeah.
So it's an enormous number. It's ridiculous. We'll never hit it. It's not insurance for me. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
It's basically a way for me to subsidize a government program.
Cyril, hang on. Jonathan Cohn, speak to that description. Cyril, 4 kids, self-employed, they're in Tampa, and, that sounds pretty rough.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think even the advocates for the Affordable Care Act would agree that if there's a spot where the law has not worked for people, your caller is right in that spot, which is buying a policy on your own for a family. You make too much. I'm guessing he doesn't. I don't know if he's still on the line. I'm guessing he doesn't qualify for subsidies that would discount his premiums. And again, the question is, what do you want to do about that? What I always try to do when I hear these stories, and I've written about a lot of people in exactly that position.
Mm-hmm.
Not long ago, a family in North Carolina. It sounds like the exact same family, actually, same costs and everything. What you need, sort of trying to figure out what you're going to do about that is the interesting question. Well, why did premiums go up to $25,000 a year? Or they went up probably to $18,000, and then there's a deductible on them or whatever. Yeah. And why? And people are like, "Why? I used to pay $8,000 for 4 of us to have health insurance." Well, the truth is, insurance policy, like from an employer, right, which is what most of us would consider the standard employer policy, they're much more expensive than people realize. The reason insurance got expensive compared to where it was before is that now we're telling insurance companies you actually have to insure sick people who you were avoiding before. And in addition, you also have to cover some benefits like mental health, like maternity, although maternity doesn't actually add that much, but, mental health. And so if you want to think about, will Trump Care get those premiums down? Well, maybe, but it's going to get them down primarily by having insurance that covers less and is less available to sick people. It's not available as available to people with pre-existing conditions, either because of price or because of the insurance company being able to screen people. And so, is that a better solution, or is that a worse? Or is there another way to do this? Is there a way to say to those people, like your caller, all right, clearly the ACA is not working for you. What can we do as a society to make the program more affordable? Can we deliver more subsidies higher up the income scale? Can we give a little bit of regulatory flexibility so the premiums become a little cheaper, but not so cheap that we make insurance worthless for people who really need it? And this is a tough question, and I think everybody who deals with health policy would agree. But that is why the insurance for this gentleman and people like him has gotten so expensive.
I mean, if you could set ideology aside, Jonathan, on both sides, and just try to cover this gentleman and his family and others like him at reasonable cost, would you do what was outlined on last Thursday night by the House or something else?
So quite possibly that gentleman will be better off under Trump Care. I would have to know more about his exact situation, but it's quite possible he'd get a bigger tax break and his insurance prices might come down a bit. The catch is that he will be subject to the same problems of dysfunctions of the old healthcare system, where potentially, and again, it's going to depend on his state and what happens, but potentially he'll find that if he or someone in his family gets very, very sick, suddenly they won't have coverage available to them, or they won't, if he loses his job and he lets his coverage lapse for a while, he won't be able to get insurance at a decent price. And I know that sounds strange because you're saying, wait, he's already paying so much for his insurance. What could be worse? Well, it actually could be worse. I mean, he could, have no insurance, or you could have policies that don't cover the same number of benefits. And so it's possible he will be better. I would guess he's probably better off in the short term, and there are certainly a lot of people like that. But the cost for him personally is that he's losing some of the security that probably, may not need right now, but if his family gets sick or runs into economic hardship, they will need. And meanwhile, at the same time, millions and millions of other people will be worse off.
Paul Howard, what are you thinking as Cyril from Tampa describes his circumstance and what the House has just offered, what the Senate might offer?
Right. I mean, I think the interesting thing here is that we're talking about a group of people, the individual market, it's transient. People are in and out of it. And I think that there are ways to kind of try and square the circle that Jonathan was talking about. One of them is, and this is not, any partisan ideological, this is just tools you can use. You can use something called reinsurance, which basically says to the insurance companies, for your very high cost patients, the patients who are, extremely high cost, we are going to step in. The government will pick up a portion of that cost to help lower premiums across the board. You can do high risk pools if they're implemented and funded well. That can also take some of those high costs. Because this is a small market, most of the people in this market are going to be young. They're going to be healthy. So affordable options for them and balancing those higher costs is what we need to do.
Support for On Point and the following message comes from Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. When it comes to the big decision of choosing a mortgage lender, it's important to work with someone you can trust who has your best interests in mind. With Rocket Mortgage, you get a transparent online process that gives you the confidence you need to make an informed decision. Skip the bank, skip the waiting, and go completely online at quickenloans.com/onpoint. Equal housing lender, licensed in all 50 states. NMLSconsumeraccess.org, number 3030.
I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point, and we are talking about American health care headed to the U.S. Senate after the big House vote at the end of last week. Celebration in the Rose Garden, but lots of criticism of what was put together there pretty rapidly after the first failed attempt. Now, the Senate picks it up. They say they'll take their time. Jonathan Cohn is with us from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the Huffington Post. Paul Howard's here from New York and the Manhattan Institute. Mary Agnes Carey covers this whole realm for Kaiser Health News and joins us today from Washington. You're welcome as well with your question on where this all stands and where it may go, how it may affect you. You don't think emotions are high on this? Let me tell you, they are. On Friday night, Idaho, Republican Congressman, this is Raul Labrador, big in the Freedom Caucus, had a town hall meeting in Lewiston, Idaho, booed in response to his question about how the House Republican health care plan would affect Medicaid recipients. The question, which is hard to hear from the audience, but she says, you're mandating people on Medicaid to accept dying, or something like that. Here, you'll listen.
You are making Americans no one wants anybody to die. That line is so indefensible. Nobody dies because they don't have access to health care.
Oh, nobody dies because they don't have access to health care, and the place just erupts in response to Congressman Labrador there. It is fierce out there. Let's go to Carol in Elgin, Texas. Carol, you're on the air.
Hi, John. This is Carol, and my greatest concern is that a lot of people don't realize what is on the list of pre-existing conditions. You can be turned down by an insurance company now under Trump Care because you were once sexually molested, if you have acne, if you are bipolar, which is very easily controlled by medication. Yep. There are allergy. There are a number of things that are going to be considered pre-existing conditions, and people don't realize that.
Just how easy it might be to be kept out of the pool or be more difficult to get insurance. Mary Agnes, we heard a lot about pre-existing conditions in this whole debate. Where did that end up in the final product out of the House?
Well, one thing just off the bat, I just wanted to address the sexual assault claim as a pre-existing condition. The Washington Post debunked that this week as a fact check in their fact checker column that is not part of the Republican bill. So, but to go to the House Republican bill, here's where this pre-existing issue comes in. If your state went for one of those waivers we were just talking about, where the state went to HHS and said they could reduce premiums or increase costs, under these waivers, if someone had a lapse of more than 63 days in coverage, that is where they could charge more based on a pre-existing condition, and that is if you had that gap in your coverage. And so what we're talking about for pre-existing conditions are some things that are very common. Lots of people have them. 1 in 3 adults, for example, might have obesity or pregnancy, depression, C-sections, high blood pressure, diabetes, things that people suffer from.
But also cancer and a lot of other things that you could be stuck with.
Right. But I think a key thing in this whole discussion about the pre-existing condition is you've got to have that gap in the coverage. If you haven't had that 63-day gap, then they couldn't get in and look at your medical history and charge you more for that. But that is one of, as we've talked about, and the Senate, members of the Senate are talking about it, this is one of these areas where Republicans have going to get a lot of heat in the House for voting for this provision, and I think it's going to give Republicans in the Senate pause.
Jonathan, what about the answer here? I mean, things happen, and people can find themselves without coverage for 63 days and with medical problems that bar them. How do you look at the pre-existing coverage of the new package out of the House?
Right. Well, and Tom, you put your finger right on the problem here, which is that when Republicans defend this, they will say, look, it's only if you have a lapse in coverage. If you keep your coverage continuously, this won't affect you, as if keeping your coverage continuously was so easy. As you say, people lose jobs. Things happen in life. And what's to keep in mind is that this is part of a larger package. We're going to call it Trump Care, the Affordable Health Care Act, whatever. This same bill would also reduce the amount of financial aid going to people at low incomes. So you're actually more likely to have a lapse in coverage because if you lose your job suddenly, under Obamacare, there's pretty generous tax credits for people who aren't making a lot of money, and that's the whole point. Under Trump Care, you'd get a lot less money if you have a low income. So you'll lose your job. You have no way to pay insurance premiums for 3, 4, 5 months. Now finally you get a new job, you go back to buy insurance, and you've had a lapse in coverage, and now the insurance company says, oh, look, you have a history, you're a cancer survivor, or maybe something, more modest. Mm-hmm. We're going to charge you, some ridiculous premium that you can't afford, and now you're stuck without coverage.
Helen in Akron, Ohio. Helen, you're on the air.
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
I'm 76, and I went on disability for blindness at age 70. I was denied coverage when I applied after my employer's coverage ran out.
Okay.
And what to do? I think, number one, I call my senators regularly, like once a week, to let them know how I feel.
Were you covered under Obamacare, Helen, may I ask?
Now, yes.
And are you worried about losing that if the Republicans take health care in a new direction?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And when your insurance ran out, you couldn't get more because of a pre-existing condition, because you're already blind or disabled by blindness?
Yes, I was denied because I had a pre-existing condition.
Wow. So you have a lot on the line here.
Yes. And I worked in healthcare for 25 years, so, I understand lots more of the terms than other folks do. And I think part of this whole problem is we've got people making these decisions who, look, when Obama talked to Trump about pre-existing conditions, Trump rattled off the words. He didn't have one clue what he was saying. And it worries me that people are putting these plans together who don't have the information they need to do it wisely.
Helen, I really appreciate your call. Paul Howard, what about someone is this an example? Is Helen an example of people who may be made vulnerable if you take that $880 billion out of the system over the next decade?
Right. So we've got several populations here. It sounds like your caller would have been covered by Medicare if she was over the age of 65. Mm-hmm. But putting her aside for the moment, I think you've got a couple of components here. One of which is I think the AHCA has the right idea, but I think you need some much stronger guardrails. So for instance, let's say someone loses coverage, they're in between jobs, whatever. Make the baseline an auto enrollment into a $0 premium plan. The AHCA currently contains $100 billion in something called the Patient and State Stability Fund. They've added probably another $30 billion for various amendments. That can be used both to offset co-pays, deductibles, other things for low-income folks, which I would eminently support, or also to use reinsurance to lower costs across these insurance markets. States, if they apply for waiver, and again, they can stay with the ACA status quo if they choose. If they do apply for the waiver, they should have to demonstrate that coverage for these vulnerable populations is not going to be impacted or it will be improved. I think that's a relatively elegant way of approaching the problem. And again, in the current status quo, we have people who can't afford the deductibles or the co-pays under the current ACA plans or priced out of them because of premiums. Balancing that is a tough question, but I do think it is doable. What Republicans need to do, especially on the Senate side, and I think with senators representing states as opposed to district, they're going to take a much wider view of this problem, is balancing the affordability on the exchange with some permanent fixes that bring down costs for populations who can't access coverage today. Remember, even when the ACA is fully implemented, we're still going to have 25 to 27 million people who are uninsured. So that's the status quo that we want to improve on.
We've got the Senate now getting right in. You had Lamar Alexander, a senator out of Tennessee, Republican, saying they're going to take their time and they're going to get it right in a speech on the Senate floor on Thursday. Here he was.
There'll be no artificial deadlines. We'll carefully consider the legislation passed by the House. We will work together carefully to write our own bill. We will make sure we know what our bill costs when we vote on it. In fact, by law, we have to do that. We will get it right, and then we will vote.
That sounds like a very different tempo, Mary Agnes, than we saw in the House. Much more deliberate. What is this going to be like? Will this be a transparent deliberation in the Senate? Where does this go off to now for the tinkering?
Well, I think we'll see some things in public and some things will happen in private. You'll have the Finance Committee headed by Orrin Hatch, a Republican of Utah, that will take a look at this. There'll be lots of pushing for public hearings. Both the ranking Democratic members of the Finance Committee and of Senator Alexander's committee, Health, Labor, Education, and Pensions panel, have pushed. Those Democrats say they want open hearings, they want transparency. So I think they may not have the same amount of time as they considered for the Affordable Care Act, but I think we'll see public hearings, we'll see testimony, we'll see lots of members getting out there talking about their different proposals. Some, like Rand Paul, want a full repeal of the Affordable Care Act. We talked about Susan Collins a few minutes ago. She has a proposal with Senator Cassidy from Louisiana to talk about whether or not states want to keep the ACA or go their own way. But I think that I just don't think the bill coming from the Senate is going to look like the House package, and that increases everything down the road because they've got to reconcile the two versions and come up with something that both sides can't agree with. And I don't think the Senate Republicans will view it in the same way that the House Republicans did. And the whole remark that Senator Alexander there had about we're going to know how much it costs goes directly to the fact that the revised House package wasn't scored by the congressional office. The additional number, if there are additional people who would lose coverage or other economic interchanges there with the bill, were not known when they voted on it, which is something else that Republicans will get criticized for as this goes forward.
Speak to this, the possibility of Democrats helping out here. On Morning Edition, NPR's Morning Edition last week, we heard Tim Kaine, of course, the Democratic senator out of Virginia and the VP candidate last year with Hillary Clinton. But he's in the Senate, of course, and said he would work with Republicans if a bill fulfilled President Trump's campaign promises, he said, on health care. And I want to ask you if this is a genuine offer or if this is a gotcha setup. But here was Tim Kaine.
If we stick to the promises that the president has made, he said over and over again, nobody's going to lose coverage. We're going to lower premiums, and we're going to protect those with pre-existing conditions. So we have to hold up those three yardsticks to any plans because they're the president's promises.
Jonathan Cohn, does that sound like a genuine consideration of cooperation here? Nobody will lose coverage. If nobody loses coverage, premiums are lower, and protect those with pre-existing conditions. I might actually work with the Republicans, Tim Kaine says. Does that sound sincere to you, or is that a way to bash this when it doesn't meet those Trump promises?
Well, I'm not sure I can read Tim Kaine's mind, but I feel quite confident in saying there is a substantial number of Democrats who would happily work with Republicans to come up with a sort of set of bipartisan answers to some of the problems we've been talking about today. So for like that gentleman, who's paying all that money for his insurance. And I think there's a real willingness to give and trade, too, to sort of, the Democrats that say to the Republicans, okay, we'll take two of your ideas, you take two of our ideas. I think there's flexibility. I mean, you listen to somebody like Paul, who's a smart guy, who has, a kind of reasonable kind of, well, here's, this, we want to think about the trade-offs. But the ticket to that conversation is they want to know that basically there's not going to be a massive loss of insurance coverage, not a massive loss of access to care. And I don't think you will see Democrats having that conversation until they are assured of that. And I do think there may be some Republicans who would be willing to have that conversation. I think Susan Collins, who we've talked about before, might be one of those people. But, they need to hear that, and that is certainly not the message that the House Republicans sent, and I'm not sure there's how much enthusiasm in the rest of the Senate Republican caucus there is for that kind of conversation.
Paul Howard, you're with a fairly conservative outfit there. The estimate was 24 million wouldn't have health insurance that would have otherwise with the first House plan. Now, if the new one is anything like that, can the Senate get out of that hole? If Democrats demand, little or no loss of coverage to get involved and cooperate, is there any way that Senate Republicans can make an offer like that?
Look, I think what senators are going to be thinking about is really about their states and particularly about their governors. People like Rob Portman from Ohio are going to be thinking about, look, we did the Medicaid expansion here. How is our state going to be impacted? How are people who are in that program going to be affected by the Medicaid changes? I think, obviously John Kasich from Ohio has already voiced a number of concerns. That is going to be the challenge that Republicans are facing. I think the interesting thing is, look, the ACA already contains something called state innovation waivers under something called Section 1332. I think a lot of Republicans, both Republican and Democratic governors, would be interested in approaching that if there was both more flexibility in how they spend their Medicaid dollars and how they spend dollars on the exchanges and be able to go at their insurance systems to find answers to some of the questions we've been talking about. If you approach it from that point of view, both providing some of the assurances that I think Jonathan and other people are looking for and some of the flexibility the Republicans want within the long-term goal of, bending the healthcare cost growth, which is, a wonky kind of goal that both right of center and left of center health policy experts want to see too, then I can think you can have a real conversation here. I think the Senate's going to be strengthened by the requirement to get a Congressional Budget Office score before they vote on anything. And that, is both going to be a challenge in terms of getting coverage numbers that are comparable to the ACA, but could also push a very bipartisan conversation.
Mary Agnes, do you see any reachable formulation here that would not involve millions fewer people being covered in this country?
Well, I think they would have to look at – you'd have to have a change in the House Republican plan on Medicaid, and that is a very strong philosophical difference between not only Republicans and Democrats, between House and Senate Republicans. So let's say more flexibility was given to states, and governors already can apply with waivers to the Department of Health and Human Services to change the way they do Medicaid. If you had a shift in the Medicaid provision as it currently exists in the House bill, that might be some room to move. We talked earlier about trying to revise the subsidy structure. Perhaps the Affordable Care Act subsidy structure could be changed a little bit, where we've talked about the caller from Florida who gets absolutely no help whatsoever. Is there some way to help people on the individual market who don't fulfill the current income requirements of the Affordable Care Act to get some coverage, so you'd have not people losing coverage and, in fact, more people getting coverage. But these are really strong philosophical divides that are going to be so hard to resolve.
Jonathan Cohn, just a few seconds here, but this is, peripheral until you need it, and then it's a huge deal. Do you see a chance of Americans ending up with something better here or not?
Something better, but it might take a few years before this cycle runs through.
Wow. Hang on to your hats and your policies and your life raft. Here we go. Jonathan Cohn with the Huffington Post. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Paul Howard at the Manhattan Institute. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And Mary Agnes Carey with Kaiser Health News. Always great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Tom Ashbrook. This is On Point.